Borderlands 4 has an invisible scaling system which is in effect basically the entire time you are playing through the campaign, and what's most peculiar about this whole thing is that they don't mention it to the player at all, or at least not directly. So in today's report, I've data mined and I'm going to break down in a rough outline what this system is and what it's doing to your game. If you'd like to look at the full write-up for this research, you can find it on Mobalytics. Every time you visit one of my articles, I get a small kickback, so it's a great way to support me for this work. So what exactly is this mechanic I'm talking about? Well, it's called Infamy, as defined by the developers numerous times in the file. It is also known as region difficulty, and this is implemented in a lot of different aspects of your gameplay. Although you might want to know that this isn't affecting you once you're at the end of the game fighting the subjugator, and weirdly enough, it's not applying to things like DLC playthroughs, or so we think. More on that later. Because Borderlands 4 is an open world game, the developers, in their own words, want it to feel satisfying when you eventually stomp enemies as part of your progression. You're not supposed to do that right off the bat, and they don't want this to be like Borderlands 3 or Borderlands 2, where you could, in theory, with enough power, go to any map in the game and just dominate. That's why they invented the region difficulty or infamy system, to essentially always keep enemies scaling above the player until the game decides otherwise. And they essentially do this with a variable which is present in basically every section of the base game, and thanks to Modern Map, you can actually see an image of it right here. You can see that the player has a World Infamy stat of 20, and Grasslands, which is Fade Fields, has level 6 with 520 points. Shadlands, which is Carcadia Burn, has level 6 with 443, and so on so forth. They are essentially doing this to hold your hand, or at least not in the way you're typically used to, rather the opposite, right? They don't want to baby you through the entire game. Instead, they want to prevent you from going through the entire game with ease by ensuring that you are progressing in the world, completing activities and so on and so forth. In fact, there is a table for Infamy reward points based on what you complete in the game, and this is one of the most significant parts of this system, period. In this table here, you can see that depending on what you're completing in the game, you'll get a different amount of infamy points, and this contributes to your overall infamy, which affects obviously the local modifier and the global modifier. But we'll get back to this a little later on because it starts to get muddy. As I mentioned, there is global caps for infamy and also local caps, which affect stuff like sub-regions of Carcadia or maybe a bunker, just different parts of the game where they want certain set difficulties for things to feel a little harder to overcome for the player and a little easier on the ladder side. Every mission you do, every silo, every drill site will give you an amount of points which will contribute towards your overall infamy rank. Those numbers I showed off aren't one-to-one, it's just to give you an idea of what the game is looking at for these rewards. There are internal scalars and whatnot that contributes to a more broader formula which is calculated to get the actual amount you'll get. But just so we're all on the same page, yes, they want you to go and do side missions, they want you to go and do drill sites, and if you don't, they will punish you. But how do they punish you? Well, before we get to that point, let's talk about the doctoring of this stat. Can you go into a save editor and cheat your infamy? Well, yes and no. No, there is no infamy stat. This isn't a value that's stored on the player, and the reason why we know this is because we did some pretty extensive research and found out that the way they are doing the infamy stat is to actually calculate it at runtime. Stuff like money, iridium, or ammo is stored on the player, and the bank is of course stored on the profile, so it was a little bit bizarre to see that Gearbox don't actually store the infamy variable on the player at all, because it just doesn't really exist. Unless you look into the game itself, like this screenshot from MapMap, where it does exist. So how are they calculating this if it's all being done without the use of your save file? Well, that's where things get interesting. Actually, it is. They look at your completed missions instead, and they are checking how many main missions has this character done, how many side missions, how many drill sites, and then at runtime they'll make that calculation and set the variable in real time. Now, to be honest, I don't really know why they did it this way. As a developer, to me, after doing some thinking, I figured it doesn't really matter if you do all these calculations at runtime, because either way it's going to happen at some point, so why not do it while I'm compiling shaders for the 50th time? Most things by developers are done with reason, and I just personally can't figure out what this one is, so if anyone from Gearbox wants to let me know, that would be super cool to know. But I'm just going to label this down to none other than a choice. They just kind of did it this way. So while you can't cheat your infamy by going in and manipulating the actual variable itself, what you could in theory do is go in and complete the missions around the world for yourself, which in turn would give you a higher stat at runtime. That would work. But at that point, you're defeating the whole idea of playing the game. So they've essentially countered save editing the infamy system with that. Really odd. Alright. Now let's get on to how does infamy actually affect your game? The answer is quite a lot, actually. Through my research, I found that not only does infamy have a direct impact on the levels of enemies around you, but it also has an impact on the types of enemies you'll see, the random events you will see in your world, and it will also affect the chance for modifiers to appear on enemies. You can actually go and check this out for yourself in-game. Start noticing it as you go through on a new character. Start noting down how many modifier enemies you see at one rank versus another rank. You should see that the further you go through the game, the more enemies you're going to potentially see. But like I mentioned, speaking of enemies, it doesn't just affect modifiers. It also affects things like the level of enemies. If you've noticed that in your playthrough you've gone away to farm a boss or do something to get a ton of XP because an enemy is 4 levels above you, but then you come back 4 levels higher and now the enemy is still 4 levels above you, that is because the game is forcing that. There is an infamy level, there is an absolute ceiling, and there is a minimum floor for this stat, and it basically confirms that enemies in the game will deliberately outscale the player, and there is almost no way to prevent it. Aside from, obviously, eating your vegetables and doing your side missions, or, as some people have reported, just getting to max level, which appears to power the system down. But that kind of defeats the point, because if you're max level, I don't think you should be doing the story at that point, right? And lastly, on enemies, when it comes to the more invasive stuff, well, it would also seem that infamy directly contributes to the ranks of enemies and the types of enemies you will see. The game has something called mixes, and it factors them in almost everywhere. When a boss spawns adds, when a level you go into or an area you go into has an enemy den that spawns enemies, infamy is directly contributing to how hard those enemies are, or what kind of enemies those are. That's right, depending on your infamy stat, they are changing the game on the fly so it feels, or at least that's my assumption, more dynamic to the player. Although how can it feel more dynamic if you don't know what's going on in the background? And it's also affecting how alive your game feels. Have you ever wondered why you've never seen tanks going around on the roads of Kairos or enemies fighting amongst each other, but someone who has 1,000 hours in the game probably has? Well, that's because infamy will directly affect the spawn chances for random events to occur in the world. This is a pretty big deal, and an even larger deal considering it's never explained to the player. There is many patrol events like creeps, pangolins, threshers, pangolin riders, survivalists, transhumans, farmers, and more. All of this is a random thing that can happen, or rather something that is gated behind a threshold, and if you're not hitting it, you're not seeing it. Now, this doesn't mean you're never going to see it. Again, I want to make it clear that this video and this information is more of a grander guideline. It does not mean that by the end of your game you will see half of the content that I will. All you need to know is that these systems do exist and they are playing a part on your game, and it's a little deeper than just enemy levels. Because outside of the migration events that we're talking about, it also seems that this may also have an effect on the NPCs you see in your world. random NPCs that are doing their thing seemingly have a spawn threshold dependent on your infamy. And something which I'm unsure if it's a typo or if there's actually concrete proof of this, potentially infamy even plays a part on radio station dialogue. Although it was very difficult to find any references to this, but just know that it's mentioned, so maybe there's a secret with the infamy stat. And let's wrap up this discussion on the infamy mechanic by talking about, well, how does this affect DLCs? Am I going to get outscaled if I go and fight the Subjugator at level 20? Well, interestingly enough, probably, because there is still that natural outscaling that Borderlands games have and are probably known for by most players. So it certainly isn't out of the question, nor would it be out of the ordinary to you as a player if you've played games in this franchise already, but in a larger scope, it does not seem that the infamy system is present anywhere but the base game. Now, it is entirely possible that there is data that I have not seen, or data that we just need to get a hold of even still to get a better understanding of this, but I was unable to find any proof that the infamy system is at play in any of the DLCs or invincible fights in the game. I've also asked around to other players and creators if they've ever noticed a hard cap like the infamy system within, for example, Story Pack 1, and received nothing that indicated that it was present, and that, along with what I see in the files, or rather what I don't see, indicates to me that this is not at play in DLCs, so that is the one place you're probably safe from it. And now there's one more thing that I haven't talked about in this video. It's shared progression. You know, that big drama in the community where people have been asking for their stats to be or to not be shared when they create a new character. Well, believe it or not, but the infamy system actually gets muddied up by this. Here you can see a list of everything that shared progression carries over when it comes to larger scale activities. And if up until this point you've been following along, well, first of all, thank you and congratulations, but second of all, you might notice that some of these directly affect infamy, and because this is all done at runtime and not stored on the save file, we hit a little bit of a bug in the system. A level 1 character who has done none of these but turned on shared progression, and now technically according to the game is going to have the scaling of their game impacted. I've asked a few people that have been using shared progression how their scaling has been with this, and a lot of them report that with shared progression turned on, the game is harder. So intentional or not, infamy is definitely affecting those who do decide to keep shared progression turned on versus off. And so I think this begs the question, is this a system that you want in your game? Do you want to be intentionally held down at certain points of progression? And do you want to be forced to go and complete missions for the game to somewhat get easier? Now, me personally, my opinion is that the infamy system is a good idea on paper, but it very quickly loses sight of what people like in a Borderlands game and doesn't really fix the core issue. If a player becomes overscaled or there is overscaled loot in the game, I don't think the right way to fix that in open world is by restricting their growth. I think that completely goes head to head and clashes with the power fantasy people expect from this series and from a looter shooter. And if you don't like it, then I think you should be completely and utterly vocal about it, especially on social media. Go and tell the developers that you do not like it and you want it changed. Just make sure that you are being completely respectful when doing so. And again, if you like this video and you appreciate the findings in it, please feel free to check out some of my work on Mobalytics because it does indirectly help me. Greatly appreciate it, guys, and I thank you for watching this video. As a reminder, this is not full concrete data, this is more so just a guideline, and greater testing is required, and there is so much more work to be done in the data mining of this information. But hopefully now, after watching this video, you have a better understanding of what is actually going on in your game, and you now know that it is there, it is present, because sadly, Borderlands 4 doesn't really explain one of its largest mechanics, and I don't really like that. But with that being said, thank you for watching, and I'll check you all in the next one.